Welcome, welcome everyone to this discussion called Queer Jewish Cinema and the Weaponization of Antisemitism. I'm Marc Siegel. I'm the moderator of this discussion that has been somewhat collectively organized by all of us here with the indispensable, fabulous facilitation of John Grayson. We call ourselves Loud Voices, and the we are filmmakers B.H. Yael in Toronto, Lior Shamriz, filmmaker Lior Shamriz in Santa Cruz, and scholar Judith Butler, presently in Princeton, New Jersey. Welcome to you all. I'm based in Berlin and Mainz, where I'm a professor of film studies at the university. And I'm very excited to discuss with the three of you, in part out of the very sincere need that I have for supportive exchange with people outside Germany about the fight against not only anti-Semitism, but what feels far more threatening in my everyday life, the weaponization of anti-Semitism. By that, I mean the use of the accusation of anti-Semitism not to protect or safeguard Jews or Jewish institutions or groups, but instead primarily to silence, stigmatize, and demonize critical voices about Israel and expressions of solidarity with Palestine and Palestinians, to stigmatize non or anti-Zionist Jews and pretty much any and every Palestinian, Arab, and or Muslim person, no matter how often they demonstrate their solidarity with Jewish people. To stigmatize post-colonial scholars and any others who discuss Israel as a settler colonial state. To stigmatize those who refer to Israel as an apartheid state or who support BDS or who think that BDS is not per se anti-Semitic, or who use the phrase, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. In short, the weaponization of anti-Semitism seems to expand the meaning and reach of the concept of anti-Semitism so that it no longer refers anymore to hatred of Jews and instead works to police acceptable public discourse about Israel. But I think I'm getting ahead of myself. I thought it would be productive to begin the discussion with brief introductory remarks in which we situate ourselves in relation to the question of the weaponization of anti-Semitism. What motivates our participation in this panel as part of this great 11-day event, Queer Cinema for Palestine? How do we experience the weaponization of anti-Semitism locally, where we are right now, where we live, where we work? I'll start off, as I have already. I think I've already started because it's a result of my experiences in Germany, where I've lived for a little more than 20 years, that I've come to understand how anti-Semitism has become redefined so that it no longer refers to, quote, discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews, or Jewish institutions as Jewish, end quote, as it's put in the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. Instead, as I just explained, it seems to have become a tool used to delegitimize, demonize, and stigmatize critical voices on Israel, regardless of whether they're the voices of Jews and Jewish groups. I don't know when the concept of Israel-bezogener Antisemitismus, so Israel-related anti-Semitism, I don't know when this concept was developed. I should have looked it up, but I didn't. But I first encountered it in Germany in the mid-2000s, at about the same time as I became aware of a growing global movement of right-wing supporters of Israel, of, I would say, anti-Semitic, as in anti-Jew right-wingers. These neo-Nazis, Trumpers, evangelical Christians, Viktor Orban's Alternative for Germany party members, etc., seem to me to be the legitimate claimants to the title of Israel-related anti-Semites. I like to joke that I chose homosexuality over Zionism. When I was 17 and president of Michigan State Temple Youth, I decided to withdraw from consideration for a prize that sent promising young Jews to Israel for the summer, because I wanted instead to pursue the possibilities of homosexual sex with the president of Northern California Temple Youth while working together as counselors at a Jewish summer camp in Wisconsin. What I didn't realize was that this particular camp was far more religious than I was used to. We had services 3 times a day with flag ceremonies in the morning and evenings. The US and Israeli flags were raised and taken down each day, accompanied by the singing of the respective national anthems. The sex was good, but the flags and nationalism didn't do me well. I may think I chose homosexuality, but Zionism didn't let Jews get off so easily, pun intended. Cut to my arrival in Germany 17 years later, where Israeli flags get routinely hauled out at student demonstrations, no matter what the issue at hand, and by politicians and newspaper photography editors to signal what? Support for Jews is how it's usually put. Well, it's never felt supportive to this Jew. To the contrary, as if unrolling the Israeli flag in such cases doesn't just further the work of anti-Semitism, namely equating the state of Israel with all Jews. Let me conclude these meandering introductory autobiographical remarks by pointing out one telling recent example of the development, or actually the degradation, of the discourse on anti-Semitism in Germany. The case of Nemi El-Hassan. She is a 28-year-old German-Palestinian journalist who in September of this year was announced as a new moderator for an educational or science television show on the West German Broadcasting Channel. El-Hassan is known for her important journalistic contributions focusing on anti-Semitism and anti-racism, including a great short report she did on anti-Semitism in the German extreme right and neo-Nazi music scene. Soon after the announcement, the Bild Zeitung, the German right-wing yellow press, which actually recently bought the US news magazine Politico, by the way, so we should all be a little concerned, Bild Zeitung published photos of a 21-year-old El-Hassan attending the yearly Al-Quds Day anti-Israel march, which in Germany is widely viewed as anti-Semitic. El-Hassan subsequently repented for her attendance at the march, which, by the way, was in 2014 during Israel's massacre in Gaza, and she reasserted her position and her history of being against anti-Semitism. Nevertheless, she quickly became discredited as being anti-Semitic herself. The TV station decided to reconsider their choice, and the right wing dug further and found that El-Hassan had liked and put a heart on a few posts, social media posts of the US Jewish organization, Jewish Voice for Peace, regarding the prison escape of jailed Palestinians, the boycott of products from the occupied territories, and the necessity of being anti-Zionist in solidarity with Palestinians. These social media likes were the final straw. And as explained by the head of the television station, they were worse than attendance at the Al-Quds Day demo. Nemi El-Hassan was immediately removed from consideration for the position of moderator, but strangely still kept in the loop as a potential writer for the show behind the scenes, but not in front of the camera. And this case is still ongoing, with individuals and initiatives fighting on her behalf. As this case sadly makes clear, accusations of anti-Semitism in Germany are now most spectacularly used to demonize and remove Palestinian Germans from the public sphere. It syncs up with a number of recent cases in Germany in which anti-Zionist Jews have been stigmatized, as well as Black activists and intellectuals who have expressed solidarity with Palestine. And it's my exasperation over this situation and my desire to exchange with all of you that has made me excited about participating in this discussion, in the hope that by sharing our experiences and sharing and developing strategies together for intervening in this degraded discourse, we can hopefully perhaps alter its direction. With those, I hope not too lengthy opening remarks, I'd love to invite you, Lior, to continue in your own lovely, inimitable way.
Hi everyone. I'm happy to take part in this panel, and I think I feel I feel a certain duty in participating in this panel. I'll introduce myself briefly. My name is Lior Shamriz. I'm a filmmaker. I was born in Ashkelon, a small city in Israel. I lived in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And then in 2006, I moved to Berlin and for graduate studies and stayed there for a decade. After that, I was a little 21st century style nomadic for a couple of years, traveling in Europe, the US, East Asia, until I settled down here in California. And yeah, since last year, I'm back to school pursuing a PhD degree in my old age. I'm a filmmaker. I tell stories that situate themselves between fiction and documentation, and my own positionality as I move in the world comes into the work. And for this reason, questions of the queer body, immigration, often Orientalism as a Mizrahi Jew, are integral part of the stories that I tell. I lived in Jerusalem, for example, where I could really see on a daily basis the mistreatment of Palestinians who were living there. And as being a brown body there, I would racially profile for a second until I can prove myself as a Jew and kind of rescue myself from the further harassment, for example, by police in Jerusalem. And I think I think in general, being this brown Jew body moving around the world gave me a certain perspective and informed me a lot about the trouble with how Jewish identity, Zionism, anti-Semitism are being intertwined and misused and weaponized. I'm going to share 2 clips from a work in progress. It's still a little rough, but I thought because it's related to the topic, it's important maybe I show clips from the work. It's a new feature-length fiction film, and I'm showing 2 excerpts. The story in general is about Eli, who is a musician who used to be an activist a couple of decades in Israel, but now lives in Los Angeles. Their partner, a gender queer, non-binary performance artist, died 6 months before, and now it's 2017 and it's Trump here and they deal with immigration. I'm going to show 2 excerpts. In the first, Eli encounters a white US Jewish choreographer, and afterwards he sees an interview with her on the internet and talks about it. She has an Orientalist view on the Middle East. She has her own interpretation of what the Middle East is, and yeah, the film is a sort of satire on that imagination, I would say, that comes from the West, from the US in this example, on what is the Middle East, and yeah, this space for fantasy. The second one is actually a reenactment or inspired by a real dinner that I had in LA, like an Israeli Jewish dinner that I was invited to, and there the character kind of has certain altered altercation with one of the other people. I think the rest kind of would speak to itself.
Okay, then we'll be back in a few minutes.
The Yemenite Jew, the Mizrahi Jew, they are still connected to the primal, raw beauty of the desert. They're connected to a more primitive form of Judaism, which is lack, void, destruction, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. This is the unique originality of the Jews. The city laments. However, we, the Ashkenazi Jew, we've dwelt in the European landscape for too long. We're obsessed with our rationalism, our words, our Western philosophy. The Mizrahi Jew is outside of all of this. They have a more primitive mind, which I think is wonderful. We should invite them into our family.
אלי, מה קורה?
מה, את ישנה?
לא, מה?
פגשתי איזו רקדנית אמריקאית יהודייה שהייתה סוג של מפורסמת אני חושב, אבל היא ממש אוריינטליסטית. ראיתי אולי את מכירה את העבודה שלה מהזמן שלך בסוזן דלל.
איך קוראים לה?
מורית פלטל.
אתה מצחיק, כי בדיוק דיברתי עליה עם שירי. היא עשתה עבודה לאיזה סמינר בלימודי תרבות שהיא עושה, ב-MA, ומורית פלטל הייתה מגולות הכותרת שלה, הרקדנית האמריקאית עם האוריינטליות המדומיינת שלה. שירי קראה לזה פנטזיות לבנות על אותנטיות אתנית תחומה, או משהו כזה. ותגיד, אני יכולה לדבר איתך אחר כך, אני לא לבד.
כן, בטח.
אספתי אותו בשוק, אני לא צוחקת. האמת שהוא נתקע פה, הוא בא לפה עם תף ג' למד יוטף.
או רונית, אסור לך לעודד אותם.
אני יודעת, אבל אני לא עושה את זה הרבה. שתדע.
יש אמיתות שאנשים פשוט לא רוצים לשמוע.
אוקיי, אז למה לדעתך נשים מקבלות פחות הזדמנויות לביים מגברים?
אולי הן לא מוכשרות מספיק? יש אנשים פשוט יותר מוכשרים. בגלל זה לישראלים יש נוכחות כזאת גדולה פה בתעשייה.
ואתה חושב שזה בגלל כישרון, לא בגלל פוליטיקה?
גם שזה מגיע ליהודים. כן? יהודים יותר חכמים. אולי אתם לא רוצים לשמוע את זה, אבל יש להם IQ יותר גבוה, זה גנטי.
אוי, נו.
אשכנזים לפחות. זה הוכח. יש להם 15 נקודות יותר ב-IQ מלבן אדם הממוצע. אולי אתם לא רוצים לשמוע את זה, אבל אני אשלח לך לינק למחקר באינטרנט.
מחקר באינטרנט, תשלח לי לינק. אתה יודע איזה לינק אני יכול למצוא לך כאלה דברים חורפנים באינטרנט לקרוא? אתה יודע איזה דברים חורפנים אני יכול למצוא לך עם כל כך הרבה זבל? מה כל כך אינטליגנטי בלקחת קבוצה של אנשים, לקחת מיליון אנשים, לגרש אותם מהבית, להשתלט להם על האדמה, ואז להכחיש אפילו לעצמך בראש שמה שעשית דפק את האזור שאתה גר בו לצמיתות. האשכנזים האינטליגנטים שלך.
זה חיים לימדתי הטמטום שלהם ועם התמיכה שלהם בביבי.
האשכנזים חתמו על הסכם שלום עם הגרמנים שעשו האלים מהקרקפות של האמא שלהם 5 שנים אחרי שנגמרה מלחמת העולם השנייה. אבל למצוא הסדר עם השכנים החדשים שלהם במזרח התיכון, את זה 70 שנה הם לא מצאו דרך לעשות. בגלל שיש להם כזאת אינטליגנציה ביולוגית, גנטית. מה שאתה לא מצליח להבין שברגע שאתה מתחיל לדבר על היררכיות ביולוגיות... אתה יודע מה... ביי, היה מאוד נחמד לדבר איתכם פה. שיהיה לכם יום טוב.
טוב, אני חצי אשכנזייה וחצי מצרחייה, ואני ממש לא אוהבת את הדיבור הקיצוני הזה.
Good to see it again, Lior.
It's so nice because to have this different positioning locally that, as you talked about, Lior, and also we see in the clip that it's so much about projections onto Israel, onto Mizrahi people from at least it seems that it's coming from the United States, even if it's not necessarily only people from the United States who are making these projections. So I think for this global event where we're each situated in a different place, it adds to the conversation to get these different projections from far away. Maybe Yael, would you like to continue?
Sure, but just to continue, follow up with that, I think the projection is that it's within Jewishness itself, not just North American Jewishness, but that, you know, it's within Israel, it's all over, that there is a kind of primacy around Ashkenazi supremacy in a certain way, but then, or Eurocentric supremacy, but also that bringing up the Jewish exceptionalism. And I think that's part of this. I think that critique is really, really important. And I like the young woman who, I don't share her sentiments, but I like her. I'm half Ashkenazi and half Mizrahi, so she passes the torch here. I'm a video artist. My name's BH Yael. I live in Toronto. I am a video artist and installation artist, and I'm a professor of integrated media at OCAD University. And we also have a minor in art and social change. And I've held some administrative positions at the university as well. My personal history and background really figures quite a lot in my work, and is motivational in many ways. I'm Israeli born as well, was born in Kfar Saba, just outside Tel Aviv. And my mother is from Iraq and my father is from Poland. And my father lost pretty much most of his family except one brother as a result of the Jewish Holocaust, and even that brother suffered a lot of paranoia as a result and died young. So my father was very, I always say, damaged as a result of that war. And my mother's background in Iraq was very much of I think she felt that it was a happy childhood in many ways until there was a kind of what's considered to be an exodus, in quotes, of the Iraqi Jewish community. And when they arrived in the newly formed state of Israel, she was taken to a kibbutz and separated from her family, and her not allowed to speak her first language, which was Arabic. Her name was changed from Nadra to Noga. So there's a whole way in which that aspect of de-Arabizing the Jews who came from Arab countries was very much at the inception of the state, and a kind of second-class citizenship instituted there. I came to Canada when I was 7, and my mother remarried, and with her new husband, we came to Canada. And from then on, I was actually removed from the Jewish community and grew up in a more of a Christian faith. There was my mother doesn't call it conversion, she would call herself a Messianic Jew. And so it was only when my sons were born that I wanted to actually reconnect with my Jewishness and to have them have a sense of their own connection to that history and to their background. And at that point, I searched out a kind of secular Jewish community here in Toronto, where they could have their B'nai mitzvahs, and it was very social justice oriented community. So in some way, as much as some of my family might consider themselves born again Christians, I think I'm a born again Jew in terms of like really making a claim for that identity, as it were. But at a certain point in my life, it really was a kind of a search for belonging, a question as to how was I positioned, how are Arabs positioned, how are Jews positioned vis-a-vis these histories and these changing identities. And so I started working on a video a number of years ago titled Fresh Blood, and it was really about reclaiming a sense of that Mizrahi Jewish identity, coming to a certain consciousness around that. But it also included the baptism and conversion and my father, a bit about my father's history in that it included looking at the racialization of Jews from within Jewishness and outside. So it was a way in which I had to grapple with my own sense of my location vis-a-vis that big history. But I also had to come to thinking, because as anybody who is connecting to that history of the Middle East has to deal with Palestine. And so there's a small chapter in that piece that really started me thinking through Palestine in relationship to Israel and the politics of the region. And I think it was a kind of naive approach at that point, because it was really, two-state solution was really the kind of I guess hope that was being held and that I thought was viable at the time. And the second Intifada really was what was my politicizing moment, I would say, in relationship to the larger context of what's going on in Palestine and in Israel. And I had started, when the second Intifada started, I started meeting with a number of people here, Jews and Arabs, Palestinians, Canadians of Israelis, Canadians of all sorts of backgrounds. And we started working on a number of initiatives and coalitions. We had the Coalition for a Just Peace in Israel, Palestine, later on, and Jewish Women Against the Occupation had been meeting since the first Intifada and organizing vigils here on a regular basis. Later on, there was a group Not in Our Name that I was involved with. So at a number of ways, it was a way of educating ourselves and the community at large. And I took a trip to Israel in December 2001. So after the second Intifada had started, with a friend of mine, Kathy Wazana, and we, there was a gathering of a number of groups, internationals, Israelis and Palestinians, of a week of activism there. And when we were in Hebron, and I saw how settlers had organized to take over the homes and shops of people that they had basically built on top of Palestinians' heads. Like Palestinian shops were on the ground, on the street level, and settlers had taken the second floor and had been throwing garbage down onto Palestinians so that there was netting that had to be put on the street to catch the garbage that was being sent. And that was just one small example of the kind of violation and violence that was occurring. And for me, I would say that was my politicizing moment, like to really begin to understand what settlements weren't just out there on the land, which they are, but also how they had been imposed onto Palestinians within their villages and homes, et cetera. And so from then on, I think a lot of the work that I've been doing has been around Israel-Palestine. And in Toronto here, we had a number of activist groups, the Coalition Against Israeli Apartheid, Students Against Israeli Apartheid, Apartheid Week started here. There were a lot of land day events, et cetera. And so those have been very formative and instructional for me. And in 2009, when Israel was bombing Gaza, and a group of us Jewish women did a sit-in, a kind of occupation of the Israeli consulate here at the time in protest as well. So those are some of the things that have kind of fueled and initiated the work that I've been doing. So one of the works that I've done, there's a series, a group called, it's 3 pieces called Palestine Trilogy that I completed in 2006. And one of them is the first piece is called Deir Yassin Remembered. And I will show a clip from that piece. There are 2 other pieces. One is called Even in the Desert, which was more documentation of kind of actions in the West Bank and in Jerusalem. And also the third one was more of a poetic piece based on a poem by Nadia Habib called A Hot Sand-Filled Wind. But the Deir Yassin piece is probably the most straightforward of the pieces in terms of documentary. And it focuses on the massacre at Deir Yassin on April 9th, 1948. I'm showing a clip that's a little further, later on in the video. So what precedes this is more of an explanation of what happened and the significance of that specific massacre to Palestinian dispossession, and that there were other massacres as well that had occurred. So I think we could go to that.
Just right here is the sign. You want to get the sign probably, right? Now here they might chase us away, so you should do it quick.
Hi.
Hi. That's היסטוריה, אז אנחנו מצלמים.
Okay. Can I please ask you to shut down for a minute the camera and explain something?
The Israeli public now don't want to admit that they are treating another nation in a vicious and incorrect and inhumane way. They have been occupying another nation for more than 40 years. It's another culture, another religion, another type of living. Even the food is different. Even the way people dress is different. And yet, they don't want to accept that they are occupying another nation. They always think of it as if it's a benevolent occupation, as if the Arabs and the Palestinians are benefiting from the Israeli occupation.
You know, we're still in that situation of saying, no, this is our country exclusively. We're Judaizing it. The people that lived here had no claim to this land. They were not rightful inhabitants. And so what we did is not wrong. On the contrary, what we're doing until today is redeeming the land for the Jewish people. And as long as that's the view of most people, you're not going to have the reconciliation and the acknowledgement, I think.
The intense fear that Israelis have of Palestinians, like where does it come from? Because it's so vast, it's so big. And at some point I came up with the conclusion that because the Nakba is suppressed, because the fact that you're living on somebody else's land is suppressed, and you can't really deal with it, but you have to like justify to yourself in some way. I have to believe that they all want to kill me. Because if I don't believe them they all want to kill me, then how come I've kicked them off their land? Then how come I can live here when they can't?
So this is all the places that they have, you know, raids, attacks and conquers, and there is Deir Yassin mentioned there was attack. I mean, of course, nothing about massacre. In the schools, they teach the pupils something like more or less, okay, we had this war, we fight it, it was just war, of course. We fought for our independent state, and because of the Holocaust and because of many things, and the Arabs wanted to kick us from here and so on, and all these stories. And most of the war, or most of what we did was justified. But there was one case of Dir Yassin that was ugly case and inhuman and so on. We must be careful not to help the state of Israel or the Israeli society to continue telling that it was the only massacre, or more or less this is what we've been told. Until we deal with what happened in the Palestinian Nakba, the expulsions, the massacres, the ethnic cleansing, and so on, we will not be able to live here in peace, never. It's a continuous tragedy. The Nakba is not something that happened and that's it. It continues running our life.
I realized that you could know the history and you could feel guilt about the history, but that doesn't make you more active towards preventing the history from coming back. The only thing to prevent from coming back is taking responsibility.
Yeah, thank you, Yael. It was actually, I also found it really wonderful to look at this, and it. At this clip, we're adding concepts or issues, I think, layers to the discussion, because here you deal with the kind of fundamental repression of the Nakba as sort of as the kind of basic state of existence for Israelis or for the state of Israel, or something, that there's some kind of that there needs to be some reckoning with that which is repressed. I mean, it's something that we all know it's going to come back somewhere, but or somehow. But I find that really quite strong in what you presented. That was one thing that came through for me.
If I can say, it's not only repressed, but it's suppressed by law. You know, that it's become codified and punishable, and to consider what that disaster was, and yeah, so it has many repercussions.
I want to say that how also it was interesting to hear it was an Israeli woman talking about the fear of Palestinian, and how that fear in a way pushes for the further oppression of the Palestinians. And it's interesting to also think of that in comparison to how anti-Semitism operates in a similar way, where a certain fear kind of creates the space for some certain atrocities to keep going.
Mm-hmm. I could say more about that woman too, because her name is Netta Golan, and Netta is an Israeli who's married to a Palestinian, and so she has she knows both sides of that, or many sides.
And Yael, the man who's speaking, is that Jeff Halper?
Yeah, so there's Jeff Halper, who was with Israeli Committee Against House Demolition, and there's also Eitan Bronstein, who used to be with Zochrot, which means remembering, which is about remembering the Nakba and trying to bring that that memory to an Israeli audience specifically. And then the last woman was Nabila Espagnoli, who is Palestinian activist, belly dancing teacher, but also she was actually in Fresh Blood as well, around talking about belly dancing. But she's also a public health administrator, used to be anyway, in Nazareth.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's useful information.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we could continue the discussion by bringing Judith in to provide their introductory remarks. Judith?
Yes. Well, thank you. I'm pleased to be here, and especially glad to see colleagues and allies in Canada, where I haven't visited for some time. I'm Judith Butler, and I come from a very strong Zionist household on the east side of Cleveland, Ohio. Was sent to the state of Israel a couple of times as a young person, stayed in fact in Kfar Saba during one of them. And I came to understand that the version of Israel that I was given within my Jewish community and my synagogue didn't match the reality that I saw and that I learned about. And like many young Jewish people at the time, and I suppose in our time as well, I resisted learning and I resisted knowing, and I got angry at people who would tell me that there were negative things to say about Israel because Israel represented the Jewish people and the Jewish people were good and maybe even had a higher IQ than the rest of the people. They didn't cite the internet, but they still, even before the internet, that was going around, you know, like who knew? And so sometimes I have an odd sympathy with young people who say, I can't hear anything critical, that is to say negative about the state of Israel. I know something about what that is because I was also that person. And it frightened me. Every step of knowing that I took frightened me more because would I lose my family? Would I lose my synagogue? Would I lose my place of belonging in my community? Would I never be able to go home again? And then who would I be? And it was only because there were other Jewish communities and other forms of solidarity, Jews and non-Jews, Jews and Palestinians, that I was able to find communities of belonging that allowed me to assume the courage of my convictions and to test my convictions against the histories and testimonies of the Palestinian people. I became an advocate for Palestinian rights, and in about 2006 or 7, maybe 2004 or 5, I guess. And then I decided to support the BDS movement in 2009. So that was an interesting period where I was very critical of Israel, but I wasn't supporting BDS. And then in 2009, after a particularly hideous bombardment attack on Gaza, I also joined, and I've been a supporter of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement ever since. In 2012, I was informed after a large demonstration against me in Germany that I would not be able to enter the state of Israel again. I got a nice message from the Israeli embassy informing me of that. And sadly, I have not been able to return to Palestine because, as we know, Israel guards every point of access, and there is no power that Palestinians have over their own borders. We might say, oh, well, the Palestinian Authority is in charge of the borders, but the Palestinian Authority at the border is working for the state of Israel. This is not a speculative claim. This is a well-documented claim. I am on the Advisory Council of Jewish Voice for Peace in the US. I have been on the foundation board of the Jenin Freedom Theater in Palestine. And I also work for the Homeless Action Alliance for my synagogue in Oakland, California, Kehila. So I've managed to stay connected with my Jewish and religious and cultural alliances of that kind, but always in the context of where I am able to speak freely and where other people, I don't always share my exact views. We argue about BDS, we argue about kinds of critiques, but it's extremely important to be part of a community that allows one to make one's art, to publish one's essays, to speak publicly without fear of censorship and without fear of being called anti-Semitic. Of course, being called anti-Semitic is one of the most painful things you can do to a Jewish person, but actually to any person, but Jews in particular, given how acutely aware we are of the history of anti-Semitism, and it is a complex and multifaceted history. It is devastating to be called a capo or to be told that you hate yourself as a Jew. When actually the history of Judaism for me is also a history of social justice, and even the slogan "Never Again" that we say, the never again is never again for anyone. In other words, if you learned from the Nazi genocide against the Jews, the Roma, the communists, the disabled, you also learned that no one should ever be treated in that way, and that we must object to all forms of racism, of genocide, of segregation, of radical social inequality, of torture. There are many lessons to be learned from that history that some of us share. I am Ashkenazi, and my family lost many people in the Holocaust, in Hungary in particular. And I have footage of that. If someone's going to help me, that would be really helpful. But was I taught that, oh, if you object to anti-Semitism and if you know your history well, you will support the state of Israel unconditionally and tolerate no criticism of that state? Well, I was taught that, I suppose, but it was only in the late 1970s that it became accepted to include, as part of anti-Semitism, the critique of the state of Israel. In other words, you could have a critique of the state of Israel and you could be opposed to anti-Semitism and nobody would say that that's a problem. But in about the late 1970s, books and articles started appearing that included the critique of the state of Israel as an example of anti-Semitism. And unfortunately, in the last years, and now with the backing of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, the critique of Israel has become the paradigm for understanding anti-Semitism. So if you are engaged in such a critique, then you are eligible to be labeled as anti-Semitic. And in the meantime, right-wing anti-Semites who hate Jews and say the most noxious and horrid things about them, and people of Asian descent, and indigenous people, and people of African descent, their anti-Semitism is linked with racisms of various kind. Many of those right-wing people who support the state of Israel and have anti-Semitic reasons for supporting the state of Israel are not included as anti-Semites. And indeed, the opposition to anti-Semitism, which we must all be committed to, has to be always an opposition to all forms of racism. Otherwise, it is an inconsistent position. But we have to fight now. We have to fight for our art, our public expression, our educational institutions, all of which are trying to tell histories of the Middle East, to bring out the history of the subjugation of the Palestinian people, the apartheid regime, the segregation, the state violence against them. Every time we try to teach the histories that we know, we are now at risk of censorship or of this quite paralyzing and nefarious allegation that we have become anti-Semites. I'll just say one last thing, which is that, you know, many people say, why are you criticizing the state of Israel? It's the only democracy in the Middle East, or it's the only modern nation, or it's the only European. They even sometimes say it's the only European nation in the Middle East, affirming that they only consider the Ashkenazim as like the legitimate bearers of Israeli state identity. And then I think, oh, democracy, I'm so glad that we agree on the issue of democracy, because in a democracy, there's open dissent. In a democracy, there's open criticism. In a democracy, the state not only tolerates criticism of its policies, but it protects the rights of people to dissent, to assemble, to formulate those criticisms, whether they are in the form of language, in the form of film or plays or exhibitions. And yet, for some reason, a consensus has built, certainly in Germany and in parts of the US and other places, in parts of France as well, that any criticism whatsoever of Israel is anti-Semitic. But if it is the case that criticism is itself suppressed or intolerable or even criminalized, then we are not talking about a democratic argument. We are no longer talking about a democracy. In fact, I think we've never talked about a democracy there, but we now see that the anti-democratic character of that state, but also the supporters of that state internationally playing out in enormously dangerous forms of censorship that actually could imperil the very discussion we're having here today.
Thank you, Judith. That brings up a number of points that brings together a number of the points that we've been talking about so far. Before I continue, I feel like it would be a good moment to bring in another video, if that's okay. Even though it's a little bit of an interruption from your important words, but the Israeli artist Yael Bartana wanted to contribute a clip from her project, And Europe Will Be Stunned, a trilogy of videos that she made about the Jewish Renaissance movement in Poland, a kind of fabulated movement that was called into existence through her work. And the first, we could look at maybe the first 5 minutes of her first film in that trilogy, which is called Mari Koszmary. In Polish, it means nightmares, from 2007. And I think it could lead us into a further discussion also about the repression, suppression of the Nakba, but also the Ashkenazi supremacy, the questions of the colonial settlement of Palestine, and possibly help us to think about some possible solutions. At least in this video, there's a solution proposed. We could see how if we want to take that up, or how that can help us further discuss.
Żydzi, rodacy, ludzie, myślicie, że ta stara kobieta, która wciąż śpi pod pierzyną Rywki, nie chce was widzieć? Zapomniała o was? Mylicie się. Ona śni o was każdej nocy. Śni i drży ze strachu. Od tej nocy, kiedy was już nie było, a jej matka sięgnęła po waszą pierzynę, nawiedzają ją mary. Mary, koszmary. Tylko wy możecie je przegnać. Niech przy jej łóżku stanie 3 miliony Żydów, których zabrakło w Polsce. I przegoni w końcu te zmory. Wracajcie do Polski. Do waszego, naszego kraju. Stańcie przy jej łóżku i połóżcie swoje dłonie na tej starej pierzynie. Cienkiej, jak prześcieradło, z której puch dawno już rozwiał wiatr. Połóżcie, mówię wam, swoje ręce na niej i powiedzcie, darujemy ci tę pierzynę. Po co nam ona? Już nie ma w niej pierza, tylko ból. Uleczcie nasze rany, a uleczycie swoje. I będziemy znowu razem. To apel, ale nie apel poległy. To apel dla życia. Chcemy, aby do Polski wróciło 3 miliony Żydów i abyście znowu byli z nami, zamieszkali. Potrzebujemy was. Prosimy, wróćcie. Kiedy was zabrakło, cieszyliśmy się skrycie. Powtarzaliśmy, nareszcie jesteśmy sami we własnym domu. Polski Polak w Polsce, któremu nareszcie nikt nie przeszkadza. A ponieważ ciągle nie byliśmy szczęśliwi, czasem udawało nam się znaleźć jeszcze jakiegoś Żyda i wyprosić go z naszego kraju. Nawet jak już wiadomo było, że nikogo z was nie ma, ciągle byli tacy, którzy was wyrzucali i wyrzucali. I co? Dziś ze znudzeniem patrzymy na nasze podobne do siebie twarze. Na ulicach wielkich miast wypatrujemy obcych i wsłuchujemy się w ich mowę. Tak! Dziś już wiemy, że nie możemy żyć sami. Potrzebujemy innego, a nie ma innego bliższego nam niż wy. Przybywajcie, ci sami, lecz odmienieni. Zamieszkajmy razem.
I have to laugh at that piece.
Sorry, you have to laugh.
I have to laugh with that piece. I remember seeing the whole piece. It was at the Art Gallery of Ontario here, and it really, you know, of course, brings all kinds of conflicting emotions about whether that speculative idea could even be possible in any kind of way. But it does harken back to the solution at the end of the Second World War, in which Europe, rather than reintegrating its inhabitants, those that had been dislocated, they, instead of doing that, they were very happy to support the creation of a state of Israel and put the Jews over there. You know, so that there is there is something about the originary problem or sin, as it were, that the piece acknowledges, and yet there's the solution is a funny one. So yeah.
I feel like it's improbability is what allows us to see, well, how pervasive Polish anti-Semitism is, right? I mean, would that really happen in Poland? I don't think so. Not the Poland I know, not the Poland where the soccer teams yell to each other, you know, Jews to the gas, Jews to the gas, as a way of saying this is what's going to happen to you when you lose this game. I mean, and they think that's fun. I mean, I don't see anything like that ever happening in a place like Poland right now, especially as it's become a xenophobic paradigm. But also it, as you say, it really raises the question, what if the post-war countries like Poland or Hungary or the then Czechoslovakia were able to say, oh, come back, you know, we're not fascist now, we got rid of the Nazis, we're not only appalled at what happened, but we want to repair, and the way for that to happen is for all of you to come back and resume your lives as full appreciated members of this community. And that certainly didn't happen. But what did happen was that the sign of your being past the Nazis, the sign of your being anti-Nazi, was to support the state of Israel, because the Jews needed sanctuary. They needed somewhere to go. Too bad that there were other people living on the land, or maybe, oh, those people who you think are living on the land, they're not really living on the land, or they are the land, you know, they're indistinguishable, or they are nomads and they don't count, right? So the sign that you object to the Nazis is that you find a place for the Jews to go where the Jews will never have to come back, which is what makes it possible to have anti-Semitic Zionism, right? I mean, it's not a contradiction in terms sometimes, depending on that. But the, you know, and Hitler also had that solution. He wanted there to be a Judenraum, a special place where the Jews would go, those who would survive his genocide.
Yeah, I get that also. This incredible warmth, generosity, and humility in this call for the Jews to return. And what always fascinates me with this piece is thinking further about what would then happen to Israel-Palestine if, not just to Europe and Poland, but then on the flip side, let's say to Israel-Palestine, if the 3 million Jews returned to Poland, namely, maybe there can be another return that could be made possible, the return of Palestinians to Palestine. And so I feel like that's part of the kind of thought experiment that this fabulous, in the true sense of the term, I think, project is intending to call to mind.
I think it's important to kind of put a light on this relationship between. There is certain feedback. I'm sorry, that's why. That in some ways, in a settler colony, the return is always there, because the contact with Europe exists in many ways since the 50s, and the contact with the US and the way capital is flowing from Europe and from the US, and the way capital fuels the occupation of Palestine. The relationship of the colonizers with their origin is always there. The Ashkenazi threat is always like, we are doing you a favor by controlling this land. We are doing you a favor by being the masters of this land, because we actually can go somewhere else better than this. So does it make sense? I think that's kind of the ego of the settler colonizer. I'm doing you a favor by, this is the benevolent occupier. I'm doing you a favor by being here.
You're drawing attention to the fact that the military budget in the US, for instance, for the state of Israel is astronomical. I believe $1 billion was just allocated for a new dome, and it is an astonishing level of support, and we can find the same in many European countries as well. So that those financial ties also suggest that the state and its external supporters are tied together, that it's a regime, that the nation-state border is one way of understanding the state of Israel, but then its global ties is another way of understanding what supports that border. Quite literally, like who's funding the technological apparatus at the border, right? Like whose machines are there. So I think it is true that we have to see it in that way, and that by linking especially to US and American funders and supporters, that the Ashkenazi identity of the country becomes more fully consolidated and lorded over those who are not both the Sephardim and the Mizrahim in different ways.
If I may ask a question, I think of each of you. I'm just our discussion has moved. I think because we've seem to acknowledge, we're all working with an understanding that the definition of anti-Semitism is it's necessary to have a clear definition of anti-Semitism, and that part of a frustration perhaps that we're feeling, but correct me if I'm speaking for you all in a way that you wouldn't speak yourselves.
Yeah, I guess the first point of where I would question is, do we need a definition of anti-Semitism? In terms of how it's been used and why it's been used, do we have a definition for anti-Black racism or anti-Asian racism and what that looks like? We know what that looks like. We know what human rights abuses or what hatred looks like. And I would go back to even, questioning the term anti-Semitism because it obscures other Semitic people, like that whole, there's something in which it's been in the way that the term has meant only anti-Jewish racism, and I think we should call it anti-Jewish racism. But anyway, just to talk about to bring it back to the terms and whether we need a definition, it's become now that we need it only in terms of fighting what has meant in the way that we've been kind of usurped in a certain way. So yeah.
It really resonates what you say about this using anti-Jewish hate as the definition rather than this kind of umbrella anti-Semitism that we know is not accurate even as a word. Because I think there's something that became almost ahistorical in how anti-Semitism is being treated, right? On the one hand, there was different kinds of hate of Jews throughout history. There was different, like even in the Middle East, the way Jews in Iran were treated in Qajar era is different than how Iraqi Jews were treated at the same time. So on the one hand, there is this multiplicity, and on the other hand, there are certain oppressions that Jews suffered, but other minority groups suffered at the same time for being a minority, for being, for example, not part of the majority, being non-Christian, being non-Muslim, but then a Christian in a Muslim country, not to say like a non-Abrahamic religious person would suffer the same or even more. So I think there is this thing that Ella Shoha talks about, these like problematic antonyms that create this anti-Semitism becomes the opposite of Zionism, and then this creates this really simplistic view of the world.
Through my experiences in Germany, I felt very taken with your desire, Yael, to not necessarily to offer another definition, but to instead refer to anti-Semitism, or to use the phrase, anti-Jew hatred or anti-Jewish racism, only because in Germany, I've come to not trust any report that of someone's someone's anti-Semitism, because it often, I mean, it's horrible that I would be so critical of this or so suspicious, but it often turns out that when I look further, there isn't a case of anything specifically directed against Jews, but it has something to do with either speaking while being Palestinian, or articulating some position about possible solutions for Israel, a one-state solution over a two-state solution, that gets one the claim of being anti-Semitic in Germany. And so I understand that. Nevertheless, I still feel that that there is something productive about trying to counter the dominance of the IRA definition, of the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition. That's not really a definition as much as a kind of list of examples, most of which, or the majority of which, deal with speech and actions around Israel and supporting BDS. And that's why I referred to the Jerusalem Declaration at the beginning, because I feel that I don't know how it is in Santa Cruz or Toronto or Princeton, but I know in Germany it really has gotten so little attention, the Jerusalem Declaration, even though some major German scholars were some of the initiators of it, and German American journalists. So I feel that it's an important intervention, international intervention. So I guess maybe it just seems that we need to fight on a lot of fronts, and make challenges in different ways.
We have to oppose anti-Semitism. It exists in the evangelical right in my country. It exists among the Trumpers. The most hideous things are said about the Jewish people. So I am not of those who say we don't need to think clearly about contemporary forms of anti-Semitism. But what galls me, and that which I fight against when I can, is the idea that having a critical relationship to the state of Israel qualifies you as anti-Semitic. That is just a rank form of censorship. We say it stigmatizes those who take that position. I don't think stigmatization is strong enough as a word. It silences them. It criminalizes them. It makes them eligible for expulsion. It makes it so they can't pass through certain borders. It makes some of us fear for our lives on the streets of otherwise, open democratic urban centers. The Jerusalem Declaration was endorsed by about 200 scholars, and it offered a definition of anti-Semitism that clearly recognized the importance of protecting advocates for Palestinian human rights from false accusation. So it built it in. It said, look, you cannot use anti-Semitism for this purpose, and here are some purposes for which you can use it. And many people applauded this Jerusalem Declaration, at least among progressive Jewish groups. We read it and it seemed like a decent enough challenge, and it showed that the IHRA was not the only voice in town, which is great. But I think that there was also a problem in it because it accepted the premise of the IHRA that there is a direct relationship between anti-Semitism and speech about Israel and Palestine, right? So some speech about Israel-Palestine is anti-Semitic and some is not, and then they started parsing like what is and what is not. the problem is that it also tried to show that it forged the link, or it underscored the link between criticisms of Israel and anti-Semitism, when in fact, if we look at what's happening in right-wing evangelical, populist, and fascist worlds, the criticism of Israel is nowhere near as important as some of the hideous ways in which Jews are identified with capitalism, or where blood libel comes back, or really horrible ideas of Jews as nefarious, amoral capitalists of some kind, and I think that that it ceded too much ground. I think we have to step back and ask, why are we looking at criticisms of Israel as the site for finding anti-Semitism now? And maybe it should have been reframed in another way. I mean, if we really look at where anti-Semitism is happening, it's happening in contemporary fascist regimes, in populist regimes throughout Eastern Europe, Bolsonaro in Brazil. I mean, we have some real areas where it's just terrifying. I'd just like to add one more thing, and you can edit me out if you want, but my worry is that something similar is happening with the IHRA that we have seen in Germany. In Germany, I don't know how many people, I mean, I studied in Germany, I speak German, I used to go there much more often than I do now, but many people would say to me, well, one way I know I'm not anti-Semitic is that I support the state of Israel, or so-and-so is not anti-Semitic, they support the state of Israel. And it almost felt like it was a kind of reflex that people would give, like, oh, anti-Semitism. They hadn't worked through the problem of anti-Semitism. Like, oh, I live in a country that killed all these Jewish people. Like, I have to work through, like, what's in this culture, what's in me, what's in my family, like, such that I would have to work through my whatever anti-Semitism is still in me. It's like, no, there was a quick out. All you had to say is that you support the state of Israel, and you are, presto, not an anti-Semite. Now, most people who come out of deeply racist cultures or deeply anti-Semitic cultures go through a long collective process of working something through. It is not possible to relieve yourself of that except through serious collective, Durcharbeitung, or whatever they call it, working through. And I really feel like this, I saw people take this ticket, like, all you have to do is say, you support the state of Israel and you're not an anti-Semite. Similarly with IHRA, the anxiety about, oh my God, am I supporting or not supporting anti-Semitism? I don't even know what it is. I don't know if I am, I haven't thought about it. All I need to say is that I support IHRA and I'm clear, right? Because that shows I'm not an anti-Semite.
Thank you for that. It speaks to my experience in Germany, definitely. And I think it's so important. Also, this critique of the kind of recentering of Israel in the Jerusalem Declaration, that seems very, very relevant, and an important step to try to figure out how we can return the definition of anti-Semitism to the Jews in a sense, and to the question of anti-Jewish racism, maybe, as Yael said, and anti-Jewish hatred.
So we thought to go back to some of the issues that we hadn't had a chance to speak about more fully. And one question that came up was, how do we think about the relationship between queers and Jews, or Jewish queers rather, and the critical relationship to the state of Israel? And of course, it's been an interesting and vexed history. As we know, there have been many debates about pinkwashing. That's the use of what appears to be a good human rights record on LGBT issues in the state of Israel in order to make a show of the fact that Israel has a good human rights record. Well, we can debate on whether LGBTQIA people are really that well off in the state of Israel. But the point is that using gay rights to mask or deflect from the subjugation of the Palestinian people clearly is a form of pink washing, meaning it erases the systemic violation of the human rights of Palestinians. I think that notion was linked with homo-nationalism coined by Jasbir Puar. And that seemed to be a position that held that the nation state should be measured by its stance on gay rights. And a lot of UN organizations actually do hold this view. And it's also a view shared by mainstream gay and lesbian human rights initiatives that are more centrist and not part of radical queer alliances. Brand Israel was a project, still is, that notoriously has been involved in producing a kind of false idea of a progressive Israel and deflecting from the brutality of its ongoing colonization of Palestine, or what some would call the apartheid state that is the state of Israel. So the queer task, the radical queer task, has been to develop a position that doesn't really follow the mainstream identity-based and imperialist notion of gay human rights as the only framework by which a country should be judged. Since then, it seems to me that queer Jewish activists have been committed not just to exposing the wretched human rights record of the state of Israel, which of course includes the subjugation of Palestinians inside of 48, under occupation in the West Bank, or siege in Gaza, but also expelled from their homeland, living diasporically. Now the oppression of Palestinians is increasingly situated within the framework of settler colonialism and systemic racism. And queer Jews have joined in those debates and in those fights, suggesting, in fact, that homo-nationalism is not a sufficient framework for understanding what's going on. So it seems to me that queer no longer marks a single issue identity politics, but a form of affiliation, coalition, and even a way of trying to establish an intersectional and coalitional framework. Queer Jewish groups have, at least in my experience, lent support to the BDS movement, as we see at Jewish Voice for Peace, which has a huge Jewish queer contingent, but also they've been committed to working with Palestinian queer groups, including Aswat, but most especially Al-Qaz under the leadership of Hanin Mackay, but also Gait Hillel. And I just want to quote Gait Hillel because I think she sums it up. You cannot have queer liberation while apartheid, patriarchy, capitalism, and other oppressions exist. It's important to target the connections of these oppressive forces among and between these oppressive forces. So that's just a little addendum to our earlier discussion.
One of the things that was struck me when you're talking about human rights is one of the issues that Hannah Arendt actually identified. And Hannah Arendt was, opposed the Zionist project in many ways, but what she identified was that the problem with the Human Rights Declaration was the right to have rights, what she talked about. So, and this is where the failing of these kind of laws is really shown in Palestinian dispossession and in the refugees and the Palestinian and the diaspora as well. But especially in the state of Israel, where the Human Rights Declaration makes the state responsible for upholding human rights. And the state, in this case, is not on the side of Palestinians. Israel has criminalized Palestinians in so many ways, incarcerating so many, including children. And so whenever we're talking about human rights, there is no recourse. That's why Israel is so acting with impunity in so many ways, because they failed in their human rights policies. And even this most recent, in the last week or so, they have identified 6 Palestinian human rights organizations and labeled them terrorist groups. That's outrageous in terms of the, not even just their responsibility to defend human rights, but then what they are doing in criminalizing legitimate Palestinian organizations who are acting on behalf of their populations and to safeguard them. So yeah, that it's, every day I feel like I'm shouting into this thing, and I'm sorry about that, but I just feel like it brings up all of those kinds of emotions for us around the injustice of the state.
I want to try to talk maybe from my own positionality and kind of bring what I find are challenges that not only people maybe in my position experience, and I would try to express them through my position, because we had this talk, and I thought a lot about context after the talk, because I'm sitting here with these like 3 definitely North American Jews, and then vis-a-vis them, I kind of, my Mizrahi identity, my like, I wasn't born in North America, I'm not from there, I'm from the Middle East, I belong to the Middle East, my ancestry there. So that's kind of the voice that comes. And vis-a-vis that, there is a certain position that I present. And it made me think also of like Mizrahis in Israel, how that position even put them in a place to actively support nationalism, be ultra-nationalists, like go sometimes in the name of I was a victim of maybe Ashkenazis, and maybe my ancestors experienced certain levels of oppressions as a minority, so I'm exonerated from this thing, and I'm going to identify with the Zionist project even more. And of course, there's other psychological elements to the question of identifying with the first thing that oppresses you, but the dangers of kind of looking outside of context and not understanding understanding the context in which certain arguments are done. And for example, pinkwashing, right? I'm thinking about my own experience with pinkwashing. Like my last film project that I made in Israel before I immigrated to Berlin, I made it by myself, no support, just with my friends, no money, like a very intimate project that expressed really my rejection in a way of like Israeli nationalism. But then like the film had certain success, it showed in festival, and it was like 2007, and Israeli consulates around the world started sending me emails, tried to kind of convince me to send my films to this festival, send my film to that festival. So actively engaging in the marketing of this kind of queer film that suddenly was out there in the world and suddenly looked, even though it's maybe a little critical, it shows something that they decided that they worth showing within the context that these festivals happen, because these festivals, what they actually market is not queer rights in Israel, but rather a certain facade of enlightenment vis-a-vis how they want to present the Palestinians, basically. So they kind of fake the context. It's again, the question of context is twisted because it's taken outside of the region and it's presented as if to the world, but actually it presented against Palestinians. And I think that's a lot of times the challenge with understanding anti-Semitism, and that's how it's so easy maybe sometimes to weaponize it. You're not willing to commit to the actual question of justice, of human rights, but you kind of buy into these questions of identity and create this kind of reductive understanding of what a person's identity is. I think you let certain atrocities, certain oppression take place.
It seems to me as well that when we add queer as an identity category, or Mizrahi queer as an identity category to a long list of LGBTQIA, et cetera, that, it seems as if all we're really doing in rallying around the identity categories, asking for recognition or, some broader acceptance. But my sense was always, I'm an old timer, and I was kind of there when queer got rehabilitated. Is that queer has to be an alliance. It has to be a term for like how you make coalitions. And what I've seen more, at least among radical Jewish queers for Palestinian justice, for instance, or, queers who are like looking into the financing of the apparatus of the occupation. And, what they're doing is they're actually linking with the critique of settler colonialism, and also helping to develop an idea of settler colonialism that includes Palestine, that includes Black life in many regions of the world, that includes the indigenous in many parts of the world, including the state of Hawaii. So I think that these forms of coalition building are linked to a broader conceptual framework, and it's harder to exploit us when that's what we stand for. In other words, if I'm just here like, oh, I'm a nice, Ashkenazi Jewish girl from the east side of Cleveland, I want you to hear my story, right? like I can get a trade book, you know what I mean? I'm like, I'm so acceptable. But if I'm an anti-Zionist and I've been working for BDS now for, I don't know, how many years, 13, I might get canceled, I might get excluded, I might lose my gig at the Jewish Museum in New York or something. And there are, I think more radical coalitions that queers want to be part of. They want to link their oppression to other oppressions, and they want to be part of those broader communities and that broader framework. So I don't know, I that's the way I feel like it's going. And of course there will always be like more narrow identity politics that just wants its place in the mainstream, like put me in your film festival, and then what happens? We're used or even exploited for our cultural identity without that broader analysis coming into play. So I hear what you're saying, and I think it's a really important point.
It's interesting. I totally agree in terms of this issue around the limitations of identity politics, and yet at times there's a need for them as well. But there's also the way in which they've been usurped, and I'm thinking also about just the kind of alliances that those who defend Israel have been trying to make, for example, with indigenous partners. There was an incident a number of years ago in Canada where an indigenous leader made some kind of comment, and that was seen to be anti-Semitic in whatever way it was. I don't even have all the specifics in mind at this point, but what resulted was some kind of alliances between Israel defenders or Zionists, etc., and indigenous communities. And so with indigenous communities, you have a lot of split. Some who are identifying with the Jewish oppression and the Jewish Holocaust and that history, and then others who are seeing this as the Palestinians are indigenous to that place and seeing this as a anti-colonial struggle. And so it's not, you know, it's not always clear in terms of these kind of the ways these alliances get played out as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm telling stories, and so it takes me to think about stories, and it take me to say that that's even when stories have limits. That's when narratives have limits, because these narratives, they have like persons, and this person, like that's where, yeah, that's when telling stories can put you in a contradiction, in oxymorons, like in paradoxes.
So there's ways in which those histories then affect the ways that we also then see stories of the future, you know? And I think that's another conversation to be had, maybe not now, but just the kind of imaginings that we have of the possibilities.
Well, maybe we end here, since I'm mindful this is a film festival and it's dedicated to imagining, to narrative,
Yes.
to offering us perspectives that we can't otherwise think about in our ordinary lives. And sometimes film does that better than you know, folks just talking on Zoom. But I'm grateful to be here with all of you, and maybe we'll call it quits for now and hope for more of a conversation later.